in an attempt to counter the U.S. hegemony prevalent since the end of the Cold War. A few developing economies came together and formed the coalition of BRICS. BRICS is an acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, respectively, and these economies intend to become the economic superpower by 2050. According to the World Factbook, these emerging markets account for 42% of the world's population, 31% of the world's GDP, and 4.5 trillion US dollars of combined foreign reserves. Together, these countries are among the top 10 largest countries by population and GDP. And needless to say, the lion's share of the global economy belongs to them. Considered to be the foremost rival to the G7 bloc of leading advanced economies, the BRICS are emerging as champions to their goal of global dominance at a considerable acceleration. To understand the background of the BRICS, let us sample the respective countries and have an overview. Brazil, officially the Federative Republic of Brazil, is the largest country in Latin America, the fifth largest country by area, and the seventh most populous, the world's 12th largest country by nominal GDP, and the largest in Latin America. Russia, or the Russian Federation, is the largest country by area and the ninth most populous country in the world. It is the ninth largest country by nominal GDP, and its mineral and energy resources are the largest in the world. India, or the Republic of India, is the seventh largest country by area and the second most populous country in the world. It is the largest democracy in the world, and by nominal GDP, it stands in the fifth rank. China, or the People's Republic of China, is the most populous country and third largest by area. It is the second largest country by nominal GDP and the second wealthiest nation. South Africa, or the Republic of South Africa, is the third largest economy of Africa and the second most populous country south of the equator. Its nominal GDP is estimated at around $411 billion, and it has the 39th rank in the world in terms of nominal GDP. Bilateral relations among the BRICS countries are based on non-interference, equality, and mutual benefit, and the BRICS gives a forum for addressing any issues between the nations. The term BRIC was originally coined by Goldman Sachs economist Jim O'Neill in 2001, who predicted the meteoric rise of economic superpowers as a foil to the U.S. economy. The term BRIC was developed in the context of foreign investment strategies and for investing purposes. The list sometimes included South Korea, which expanded the acronym to BRICS or BRIC. In September 2006, four BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, met at the United Nations General Assembly in New York City and floored their concerns about U.S. supremacy and the ways to counter it. Many issues were raised, including forming a coalition between these countries to counter the U.S. hegemony and form an alternative source of economic power that can benefit multipolar world dynamics. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva from Brazil, Dmitry Medvedev from Russia, Dr. Manmohan Singh from India, and Hu Jintao from China, as the respective leaders of their countries, attended the diplomatic meeting in Yekaterinburg, Russia, on 16th June 2009, and this was the first ever meeting of the BRIC coalition. The global economic situation and financial institutions were discussed as the main agenda in this meeting, and they also discussed how these countries could better cooperate in the future. Further discussion was held on how the emerging economies of developing countries could partake in global affairs in the near future. The need for a global reserve currency was also announced in the aftermath of the BRIC Convention, which had to be diverse, stable, and predictable. It ventilated upon the fall of the value of the US dollar against other major currencies. By 2010, South Africa strived to join the BRIC coalition, and on formal invitation by China, it became a member on 24th December of the same year. The term BRICS was coined to include the nation of South Africa, and the nation's president, Jacob Zuma, attended the summit in Sanya, China in 2011 as a full member. Countries like Argentina and Iran have expressed interest in joining the BRICS group. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt have also expressed their interest in joining the BRICS group, but they have yet to submit a formal application. To be a part of the BRICS, any country can apply for an invitation following the unanimous backing from all BRICS countries. Brazil. To understand the positioning of each country in the BRICS group, we must discuss the economic and political landscape of each of them respectively. Brazil is a democratic federative republic with a presidential system. The current president is Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who has been elected for a 4-year term. The political administrative organization of Brazil comprises the Union, the states, the federal district, and the municipalities. These are the spheres of government, and the federation runs on political pluralism. Brazil has a multi-party system, and voting is compulsory. Rich in natural resources, Brazil has an upper-middle income, mixed market economy, and its currency is the Brazilian real. It is the 10th largest economy in the world by nominal GDP, with the world's 5th largest labor force. The world's largest producer of coffee, sugarcane, soy, and orange, Brazil is the 24th largest exporter of goods globally. Russia is an asymmetric federal republic with President Vladimir Putin as the head of state. It is a multi-party representative democracy with 3 wings of governance: the legislative, executive, and judiciary. The ongoing war with Ukraine has shed some light on Putinism, leading to a democratic backsliding, an authoritative state under dictatorship and kleptocracy. Russia has a mixed economy and huge natural resources, especially oil and natural gas. It is the world's 9th largest economy by nominal GDP and the 13th largest exporter. 45% of Russia's federal budget revenues are derived from fuel trading and have one of the lowest external debts among emergent economies. Its currency is the Russian ruble. India is a parliamentary republic with a multi-party system and the largest democracy in the world. The Prime Minister is Narendra Modi and the President is Draupadi Murmu. Federalism defines the balance of power between the Union and the states, and it is a representative democracy where majority rule is tempered by the minority rights protected by law. The three wings of governance are the legislative, executive, and judiciary. India is the sixth largest economy of market exchange rates and has the second largest labor force in the world. Its currency is the Indian rupee. India is the 16th largest exporter, and major industries include textiles, telecommunications, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, biotechnology, food processing, steel, transport equipment, cement, mining, petroleum, machinery, and software. China is a socialist state governed by a people's democratic dictatorship led by the working class and based on an alliance of workers and peasants. China is a unipolar Marxist-Leninist state, and the current president is Xi Jinping, serving as the paramount leader. The Chinese Communist Party runs the country, and although its rule is communist and socialist, it has the reputation of being authoritarian and corporatist. China is the world's second largest economy in terms of nominal GDP, and in terms of purchasing power parity, it is the largest in the world. It is the world's largest exporter and the second largest importer, and its market economy are based on private property ownership. The Chinese yuan has been legitimized as a global reserve currency, and China holds the first position as a manufacturer in the world. South Africa is a parliamentary republic, and the president is both head of state and head of government. The executive, legislature, and judiciary functions according to the country's constitution, and there is no fixed capital city in South Africa. Cyril Ramaphosa is the president, and the currency is the South African rand. South Africa has a mixed economy and is the third largest in Africa. It has a high poverty rate and unemployment and is ranked among the top 10 countries for income inequality. The government has increased the role of state-owned enterprises, leading to a better economy and the 58th safest tax haven in the world. A mining powerhouse, South Africa is the fifth largest producer of gold and the only country in Africa to possess a nuclear plant. In the next episode, we will discuss the rise of China as an economic superpower, and in other coming episodes, we will ventilate upon other BRICS countries. China underwent a series of reforms until it became a market-based economy. Currently, China is the fastest growing economy in the world and the largest exporter among the other countries. It is an important player in international trade, and understanding its economic history will be beneficial to gauge the current economy of China. Over 2,000 years, China has been an economic powerhouse, yet experiencing stages of growth and decline. During the 1700s, it accounted for 1/4 of the global GDP. During the 1800s, it accounted for 1/3 of the same. During the 1820s, its GDP was 6 times that of Britain and almost 20 times larger than the US. Major economic developments happened around the 1940s in China after recovering from the Second World War and internal conflicts between the Chinese Communist Party and the KMT. The Chinese Communist Party adopted an economic system borrowed from socialism and communism and significantly changed China's political and economic scenario. In the 1950s, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, China adopted the Soviet economic model to drive growth. It involved state ownership in industries and major sectors, agriculture organization, and centralized economic planning. The first five-year plan happened in 1953, and 67.5% government ownership of industries and later private ownership was dropped. The Great Leap in 1958 was a flagship economic and social campaign to promote industrialization and attend to the agriculture sector's needs. However, the Great Chinese Famine followed suit, and it was a disaster. In 1966, Mao Zedong spearheaded the Cultural Revolution, which greatly influenced China's economy. After he died in 1976, Deng Xiaoping focused on the gap in centralized economic planning and introduced socialism with Chinese characteristics, where, along with communism and socialism, elements of the market economy were also used to maximize the benefits of globalization. A socialist market economy emerged in China, and in 1992, Jiang Zemin officially introduced the term. The U.S. thought that by including China in the World Trade Organization, it was playing a fair gamble, but instead the latter wrote its own script and used the opportunity to better its economic power. The U.S. hoped that China would change its policies and adhere to the rules of the WTO. Instead, they would give up little in return. The U.S. thought that it could check on the communist regime of China and that adding China to WTO would legitimize it, as it was the largest trading company outside the organization. But something else was in store for the fate of China. Consumers were more inclined towards China as they could purchase cheap goods. The increased access to China's humongous market benefited corporations. Cheaper labor in China costs jobs in the U.S. The Chinese population was lifted from extreme poverty. Since its indoctrination in the WTO in 2001, the Chinese economy has increased 11 times. China became the world's largest exporter. The way the U.S. had hoped, China did not conform to democracy in the same manner. The China shock, or the China trade shock, impacted the United States and Europe in a very detrimental way, and the Chinese economy boomed. China skirted the less convenient restrictions of the WTO and carried out certain market-distorting practices, in the process cheating the system. While remaining largely closed to foreign goods, China promotes its exports and thus making it difficult for companies to do business there. The forced technology transfer from foreign companies operating in China is yet another criticism, and China has finally taken steps to rectify its position. Since joining the WTO, China has reaped enormous benefits, and the growth of the middle class has been huge. The economy has grown 100 times since 1978 and is slowly traveling to becoming a world leader soon. The WTO, frankly, does not have the power anymore to rein China in. A major reason is that they have not updated their regulations for more than 25 years. China has learned to skirt the rules like no other. Hence, the economy works towards it. not against it. China's Herculean rise as an economic superpower spanned just 4 decades and has considerably impacted the India's tryst with destiny, since its independence in 1947, brought social, economic, and political freedom. 75 years later, India is striving to join the $5 trillion economy club, and the hopelessly developing nation brought about by the steady deindustrialization by the British rule in the country was aiming to soar to higher altitudes with its newfound economic freedom. In 1948, the Industrial Policy Resolution was brought about by the first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, which proposed a mixed economy and also a substantial public sector envisaged with state regulations to protect indigenous industries. The Planning Commission in 1950 devised the 5-year plans and modeled on that of the USSR to revive the agriculture sector, as India was importing food grains to feed its people. The first 5-year plan was devised to tackle the dependence on imported goods in 1951. The second 5-year plan in 1956 laid the foundation for economic modernization, and the License Raj began, under which one had to take licenses for every business they were doing. In the 1960s, following the war with China and Pakistan, India was on the verge of a great famine. Lal Bahadur Shastri, the next Prime Minister, took steps to counter the food scarcity and lead from a green revolution to an evergreen revolution. Indira Gandhi nationalized banks in her term in 1969 and devalued the rupee by 57%, which affected the Gulf nations. Many years later, the people's car, Maruti Suzuki, flooded the markets in India. Although conceptualized by Sanjay Gandhi, Indira Gandhi's son, a joint venture with Japan's Suzuki had to fulfill the masses' dream project. By 1991, Finance Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh brought in the LPG, or liberalization, privatization, and globalization era, and opened the markets, abolishing the license Raj. This made India sail through global recessions and remain unaffected by the same. In liberalized India, investments in the stock market were a growing game, and Sensex touched an all-time high of approximately 40,312 points in 1991. In 2016, Prime Minister Narendra Modi imposed an overnight ban on the highest currency notes, 500 and 1,000, to counter black money and digitize the monetization process in India. He then replaced the Planning Commission with the Niti Aayog, which serves as the government's think tank. The Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code was introduced by Modi, which made it possible for lenders to oust errant promoters and hand over the company to better parties. The Goods and Services Tax, or the GST, was a blanket tax introduced by Modi on all commodities. The country saw around 100 unicorns or startups estimated at 1 billion in value. India's economic reforms in the 1990s and their impact on the economy. Far-reaching changes in India's economy were seen in the economic reforms of the 1990s. A severe balance of payments crisis triggered a wide range of policy reforms during this decade. These reforms catapulted the Indian economy to unprecedented growth during this time. After 1996, these policy reforms lost momentum, and some international economic environment deterioration contributed to an overall fall in growth in the latter half of the decade. The crises and reforms of 1991-1992, owing to the Gulf War and the jacking up of petroleum prices, influenced the world economy, and external debts became a growing concern. In 1991, Finance Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh brought in a few reforms to tackle the crisis that threatened a full-scale recession in India like the world. Virtual abolition of industrial licensing, 20% rupee devaluation, replacing the complex import licensing with a system of tradable import entitlements earned through export, opening up of foreign investments, cutting the fiscal deficit by 2% of GDP, launching of banking reforms, and outlining of major taxes were few features of the changes made, leading to a swift restoration of health of India's external sector. Between 1992 to 1997, export growth soared. Inward remittances by non-resident Indians quadrupled. The current account deficit in the balance of payments never exceeded 2% of the GDP. Foreign investment soared. The debt service ratio was half. Short-term foreign debt to foreign exchange reserves plummeted down, and the GDP grew steadily. In the ninth plan period of 1997 to 2002, the average GDP growth dropped to 5.5% as the inherent instability between the coalition government increased. The Thai financial crisis highlighted the issues of the Asian countries, and the Dave Gowra United Front government announced its decisions about the government pay scale, which cost the economic health of the country. The international economic environment for India also weakened after 1997, and the Asian crisis of 1997-1998 cut exports and private capital flows. The economic sanctions following the nuclear tests in 1998 compounded the problem, and the surge in international oil prices had negative effects. Since 2003, there has been a renewed interest in the growth of the Indian economy, as the 10th plan predicted a growth of 8% till 2007. Since the economic reforms of 1991, the de-reservation of industries in the public sector, liberalization and abolition of the industrial licensing system, privatization of public sector enterprises, globalization, and the welcoming of foreign private investment and foreign technology with trade liberalization marked the tenets of changes made within the Indian economy. We are still reaping the same benefits, and India is currently striving to be in the $5 trillion economy club. Along with the economic reforms in 1991, the IT sector grew substantially. The creation of software technology parks in India was the first major IT reform that happened, and massive restrictions on overseas investment were diminished, and foreign investments were welcomed. The information technology industry in India became free, and more enterprises went for IT outsourcing. With the inception of Windows and programming languages such as BASIC and C, the scope for the Indian IT brain increased, and the IT sector boomed at 50% per year. The National Task Force, the new Telecommunications Policy 1999, and the IT Act 2000 all helped in India's IT sector's growth. The National Task Force provided a detailed report with 100 recommendations to help improve the IT services in India, and IT exports touched more than $50 billion. The new telecommunications policy helped free the telecommunications sector in India, and the satellite, towers, and other telecom businesses were no longer owned by the central government. Thus, the entry of the private sector helped boom the IT industry further. The IT Act recognized digital signatures, electronic documents, offences, and contraventions which now did not require meeting in person to finalize deals, thus attracting the U.S. Branded as the leading outsourcing destination, India could easily be the next Silicon Valley, as Bengaluru, the largest IT hub in the country, has been touted as the most dynamic city in the world. According to the Global Innovation Index, there is an emerging startup and innovation culture, and India moved up its rank to 52 between 2015 to 2019. In 2019, India ranked third in attracting investment for technology transactions, owing to its low-risk regulations. Global protectionism is the fuel for innovation in India, and the country's outsourcing industry is valued at $150 billion. The spread of technology and increased internet and smartphone users have created a fertile ground for startups. Over 100 unicorns are estimated at a value of $1 billion each, thus attracting a lot of people to work in the IT sector. Foreign and domestic investments with government support can help launch India as the next big player in the IT hub. Market commentators believe that India's influence is set to grow exponentially. India is a more attractive alternative as far as the US-China tussle goes on, and recently Indian startups have got a foreign direct investment of almost $34 billion. In 2016, Brazil was a colony of Portugal up until 1822. Till 1872, Brazil's early years as an independent country were extremely difficult, as its GDP growth failed to outpace its population growth. In 1870, Brazil's trade with the U.S. was estimated at $31 million, and with the outbreak of the First World War, Brazil's trade with America was estimated at $154 million. The coffee cycle between 1840 to 1930 impacted the Brazilian economy far more than sugar or gold, and the coffee trade saw an expansion in the railroad framework of Brazil. Coffee was the mainstay of the Brazilian economy, accounting for 63% of the country's exports in 1891, and an increasing trend towards coffee overproduction was seen even during the periods of the Great Depression or the World War. The Second World War saw a drastic reduction in coffee production, and the Brazilian economy was ready to grow. The import substitution industrialization era between 1945 to 1964 saw foreign reserves accumulate, which reduced trade restrictions under President Getúlio Dornelles Vargas. Between 1950 and 1961, the GDP growth exceeded 7%, but import substitution increased dramatically instead of alleviating the balance of payments problem. The stagnation and spectacular growth between 1962 to 1980 resulted in the total value of imports rising to $4 billion, and between 1968 and 1974, Brazil saw the rate of inflation decline steadily. During the stagnation, inflation, and crisis period between 1981 to 1993, the GDP increased only by 2.9%, and the 1980s was touted to be the lost decade. 1990 to 1993 saw the era of neoliberalization, plano color, and hyperinflation in Brazil. The introduction of the Brazilian real as a part of the Plano Real Plan was seen at this time. The Plano Real intended to break inflationary expectations by pegging the real to the US dollar, bringing inflation down. GDP grew to 5.1%, despite the 2008 to 2010 world financial crisis during Lula da Silva's tenure. Today, the Brazilian economy is majorly dependent on agriculture, mining, industry, creative industries, tourism, energy, and transport. In 2021, Brazil exported $280.4 billion and imported $219.4 billion, with a surplus of $61 billion. Brazil's reliance on commodity exports and its impact on the economy. Brazil's reliance on commodity exports threatens its long-term growth and adversely impacts the economy. Mineral, agriculture, and other primary products comprise 50% of Brazil's total exports, and in 2012, exports grew to $256 billion. Exports of manufactured goods were Brazil's cash cow, and over the few years leading up to 2012, the value of the commodity exports has quadrupled. Brazil is one of the world's leading exporters of coffee, sugar, soy, tobacco, and orange juice, and the dependency on these product exports is adversely affecting the economy. Brazil's financial health has improved by the growth fueled by commodity export success, and also helped weather the global financial crisis of 2008 to 2010. Yet, significant challenges are posed by the heavy reliance on commodity exports, especially threatening the medium and long-term prospects. Favorable commodity prices are short-lived, and while the market is profitable, the commodity prices may increase. But in a non-ideal situation, when the commodity prices fall, there can be a severe contraction in the economy, as it happened in China. As global commodity prices have begun to fall, it has adversely affected Brazil and will continue to do so whenever prices decline. Lost export revenues entail the risk of commodity dependence, and Brazil has lost out on manufacturing, which is crucial for sustainable, equitable development. On this front, Brazil is losing out to other developing countries, especially China, as Chinese manufactured goods are replacing that of Brazil. The commodity boom put upward pressure on the Brazilian real, and the appreciation of the real to 40% by 2010 has further hurt Brazilian manufacturing due to increased imports. Should commodity prices drop, deeper structural issues could make Brazil more vulnerable than it already is. Low labor productivity and rising unit labor costs have been attributed to the low quality of labor in the country, thus affecting the economy adversely. Weaknesses in the Brazilian labor market show pitfalls. For about 69 years, Russia operated based on a centrally planned economy, and so did the rest of the Soviet Union. The state controlled almost all means of production, and overinvestment, production, and consumption decisions within the economy. The Communist Party decided the economic policy and controlled all aspects of economic activity. In the early 1990s, the Soviet Union collapsed, and Russia found it difficult to transition from a planned economy to a market-based economy. Under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, up until 1987, much of the structure of the Soviet economy operated under him. The central planning system allowed the leaders to marshal resources quickly during a crisis, such as the Nazi invasion, and to re-industrialize during the post-war period. The Soviet Union became a superpower, especially because the defense was rapidly developed during the post-war period, along with the industrial base. Under the tenure of Boris Yeltsin, basic tenets were implanted under the market-based economy, such as market-determined prices post-1991. Macroeconomic stabilization and economic restructuring needed to be achieved to transition from a planned economy to a market-based economy. Opening the domestic market to foreign trade and investment helped achieve these goals, and by 1996 the results were mixed. In the 1998 Russian financial crisis, hyperinflation was brought about due to the removal of Soviet price controls, and Russia took up the responsibility of settling the USSR's external debts. The Russian GDP contracted by about 40% between 1991 to 1998, and critical elements such as the privatization of state enterprises were rushed into place, along with the comprehensive commercial laws. By the mid-1990s, it was unlikely that Russia would go back to the central planning model, but its foray into a market-based economy remained unpredictable. The Russian GDP doubled under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, and by 2007 the GDP grew to 8.5%. During Putin's tenure, the industry grew by 75%, and the investments grew by 125%, meaning it has overcome the 1998 Russian financial crisis. The middle class grew from 8 million to 55 million, and the number of people living below the poverty line decreased from 30% to 14%. 2008 to 2009 saw the Great Recession gradually devaluating the ruble, and in the 2014 to 2017 Russian financial crisis, the ruble collapsed and there was a fall in oil prices. The 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine saw the stock market fall up to 39%, and the Central Bank of Russia announced interventions to stabilize the market. The war has cost Russia deeply, and significant investments were pulled from the Russian market, and there was also a suspension of import through shipping routes. Russia is a country gifted with abundant natural resources, and its economy is heavily dependent on them. In a resource-focused economy such as Russia, the adverse effects can be attributed to the lack of manufacturing productivity and the increased importance of resource exploitation in Russia's exports. This effect is prevalent in many economies based on natural resources and is popularly known as the Dutch disease. Russia's dependence on oil for its economic growth points towards the fact that it is suffering from the economic ailment of the Dutch disease. Russia has also suffered from the ruble's appreciation due to high energy exports. A decrease in employment in the manufacturing sector and a rise in Russia's service sectors point towards the fact that Russia is plagued with resource dependency, and much of its increased manufacturing productivity can be attributed to the poor productive environment under communism. During the 2000s, there was a period of economic recovery, which is explained by the increase in manufacturing despite the decrease in employment. It can be seen that whenever Russia has not relied upon its manufacturing sector, there have been periods of financial contraction. In 2004, Vladimir Putin attempted to control the ruble's appreciation against the dollar, thus protecting domestic businesses with growing imports. It was largely unsuccessful, resulting in inflation. Russia has faced significant difficulty with the appreciation of the ruble, and it led to strong upward pressure on the ruble caused by the resource-dependent nature of its economy. The implications of the political economy play a prominent role in the development of resource-dependent countries like Russia. It can be argued that rent-seeking in Russia and its political fallout results from a weak legal system. Resource The Union of South Africa was formed in 1910, following the coming together of the Tsar, or Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek, and the Oranje Vrystaat. Diamond was discovered in 1866, and gold 20 years later. And during the age of African colonization, due to its abundance of gold and diamond reserves, South Africa attracted the majority of overseas investment to the whole African continent. Cecil John Rhodes of the De Beers Company passed the Glen Grey Act in 1894 to force labor into the mining corporations, which otherwise saw a lack of the same earlier, and as it grew, the Chamber of Mines was formed. The dispute between the white racist miners and the black miners, backed by the South African Communist Party, was labeled as the Rand Rebellion in 1922, and Union Defense Force troops had to be dispatched to break it up. The new influx of white poverty formalized a system of racial discrimination against the blacks, known as the apartheid, and in 1948 the government introduced the policy of apartheid or segregation, where different racial groups functioned in different areas, not intermingling with each other. White South Africans enjoyed higher standards of living, while the black population was reeling from crumbling poverty, and throughout the 1960s, South Africa produced twice the amount of electricity, 6 times the steel, and 43% of Africa's total mineral output. The Mines and Works Act in 1911 and 1971 determined poorer wages for the non-white population working in the mines, and by the beginning of the 1980s, South Africa's inequality grew substantially. Foreign capital flooded in, and several banks set up their branches in South Africa to exploit the low wages of the non-white workers, and these businesses supported the apartheid. In 1990, Nelson Mandela was released from imprisonment and his party, African National Congress, was unbanned. The ANC maintained a mixed economy and encouraged a market-based economy, relaxing foreign exchange controls. The ANC also initiated a system of black economic empowerment that aimed to establish equality, which was absent earlier. South Africa held its first non-restricted racial elections in 1994, making its foray into democracy. In the late 2000s recession, the recovery has been primarily led by private and public consumption growth, while export volumes and private investment are yet to recover. In 2017, President Jacob Zuma sacked Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan, and due to the reshuffling of the cabinet, the South African rand lost more than 11% in the following week. Inequality and growing crime rates have hurt the economy dearly, and it is a severe constraint on investment by 30% of enterprises in South Africa. South Africa's economy has become more developed through competitive trade and investment. Unlike other African economies, South Africa is less dependent on the patronage of foreign markets and more reliant on its abundant natural resources, which has helped the economy boom. Social unrest and lack of transparency in the government have led to governing inefficiency, and it has adversely affected the economy. The abundance of South Africa's natural resources makes it one of the world's largest sources of raw materials. South Africa produces 10% of the world's gold from around 30 functioning mines, making it the world's largest producer of gold. South African reserves of iron ore, copper, platinum, silver, manganese, titanium, chromium, and radioactive uranium, with the second largest reserve in the world, also comprise its huge bank of natural resources. South Africa is home to two-thirds of the world's platinum, and about half of the chromium, gold, and diamonds revolutionized the country, helping strengthen the country's economic structure. These discoveries ensure a solvent economy and its non-reliance on foreign investments, thus strengthening the economy. The diamond industry has created millions of jobs in the country and outside, and South Africa is one of the biggest exporters of diamonds in the world. South Africa is one of the world's largest coal producers. Nearly 40% of the coal is used to generate energy. The beautiful scenery of South Africa is a valuable natural resource, and the tourism industry employs more than 10% of the country's labor force. The forest sector employed nearly 160,000 people and contributed roughly 11% of the nation's agricultural income. Fruits in South Africa are an important source of revenue in the country, and it is home to 1.5% of the grape vineyards in the world, making it one of the top 10 wine-producing countries. The fishing sector contributed $404 million. Saudi Arabia is a unitary Islamic absolute monarchy ruled by King Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud and Crown Prince and Prime Minister Mohammed bin Salman. It has a nominal GDP of $1.01 trillion and is the largest economy in the Middle East and the 18th largest in the world. Saudi Arabia has the world's second largest oil reserve and the largest petroleum exporter. Saudi Arabia has the fifth largest natural gas reserve and is touted as the world's energy superpower. Saudi Arabia also has a significant gold mining sector, and Mecca attracts Muslim pilgrims from all over the world as it is the holiest city for them. Saudi Arabia has expressed interest in joining the BRICS coalition following the hostilities between them and the U.S. due to the war between Russia and Ukraine. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman expressed his interest in joining the BRICS group in October 2022 when South African President Cyril Ramaphosa visited Riyadh. The latter also informed Turkey and Egypt's interest in joining the BRICS. The BRICS summit that is about to take place in South Africa in 2023 will discuss the group's scope for growth. Following the murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi and Prince Salman's apparent role in it, Joe Biden's election campaign painted Saudi Arabia as a pariah state. But what is perplexing is that after Biden was elected the president of the U.S., he went to Saudi Arabia and tried to better their relations to guarantee the low price of oil to punish Russia. So, although Saudi Arabia has been a long-term friend of the U.S. from the Middle East, recent considerations depict the thawing equation the two nations have between them. Russia is making opportunistic advances towards Saudi Arabia. Following the establishment of OPEC Plus's oil output agreement and Prince Salman's maiden trip to Russia in 2017, the relationship between the two countries has significantly improved. The U.S. would be in a very sticky position if the world's largest oil and natural gas producing nations came together and regulated oil prices. Saudi Arabia rejected demands from the U.S. and European Union leaders to increase oil output to help control inflation and relieve the pressure on the world economy when prices soared to $130 per barrel. Instead, Saudi Arabia and other Gulf leaders criticized the West for not prioritizing new fossil fuel development. BRICS will launch its currency with a bucket of 5 currencies backed by gold. If Saudi Arabia joins them, it would be a revolutionary and game-changing move in the world, which would change the world order. This is because the currency will not only be backed by gold, the most expensive metal in the world, but also by the most precious commodity of oil. The BRICS would be formidable, and the current dominance of the West will be gone. Saudi Arabia, the largest U.S. export market in the Middle East, invited Chinese President Xi Jinping to Riyadh as U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia have faltered due to Joe Biden's stance during his election campaign. Saudi Arabia is now actively manufacturing ballistic missiles with the help of China, and this relationship could have a domino effect on other Middle Eastern countries. Saudi Arabia has also announced that they would accept the Chinese yuan for future transactions instead of the US dollar. Saudi Arabia was also invited to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS. This could have great ramifications for the rest of the world as it strives to end dollar supremacy. Since the outset of the Western alliance sanctions against Russia, an increased geopolitical influence from the BRICS group has been predicted. A global financial cleaving is underway as the West is for climate change fuel policy, while the rest of the world remains pragmatic towards fossil fuels. The Build Back Better policy of the West is in direct contradiction with the rest of the world's inclination towards traditional forms of energy. Saudi Arabia joining the BRICS would assure the influence of the Western alliance is thawed. The politics and security cooperation aspect of BRICS has been at the center of its ambitious expansion. This, combined with Saudi Arabia's evolving relationship with the West, makes the geopolitical value of BRICS a lucrative offer for the Saudis to join the BRICS group. The performance of BRICS' history of political and security cooperation has been underwhelming, and the existing 5 countries have been unable to come to a consensus as far as the international arena is concerned. Brazil voted against Russia in the UN Security Council, and China encroached upon Indian territories very recently. Firstly, it indicates that China exerts the lion's share of influence. We are in the middle of a significant era of change since the Second World War, and an international system, once dominated by the great powers of 1945, is paving the way toward a multipolar world. The BRICS and the MINTs, Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey, are achieving historically unprecedented poverty eradication and growth rates. The established structure of global governance is inadequate to confront global priorities, such as global warming. It appears more dated than ever, failing to include new centers of power in the world. Meanwhile, the BRICS' ambitions and place on the world stage have grown, and South-South development cooperation has been rising. In the post-2015 era, the BRICS introduced 2 new principles for global development. First, they talk about universality, where the SDGs will apply to all countries as opposed to the MDGs for only developing nations. This is a massive paradigm shift from a framework that took from the rich and gave to the poor to a universal approach for development worldwide. Secondly, they talk about common but differentiated responsibilities, or CBDR, that originated as an international environmental legal principle, where it is argued that all countries have the same duties. However, some do not have the means to achieve the same goals. The BRICS' main priorities of the post-2015 agenda can be classified into agriculture, technology, energy, expanding gender equality, and peaceful society discourses. The BRICS aims to correct and prevent trade restrictions and distortions in the world agricultural market. For technology, the BRICS want to scale up technology transfer by facilitating sustainable and resilient infrastructure, strengthening the scientific and technological capacity, and promoting international cooperation in research. For energy, the BRICS invoke the CBDR principle to expand energy sources, not to hamper the developing countries' growth. Women's empowerment is a profound change in the global development policies of the BRICS countries, and developmental approaches to achieving peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development are also on the BRICS agenda. The BRICS defended the international rule of law to usher in a new beginning in global politics. The new development bank established by the BRICS is a multilateral development bank headquartered in Shanghai, China, and the bank supports public or private projects through loans, guarantees, equity participation, and other financial instruments. The initial authorized capital of the bank is $100 billion, and the agreement on the NDB specifies that everyone will have one vote and no one will have veto power. The bank aims to achieve three broad objectives, among which, firstly, it will promote infrastructure and sustainable development projects with a significant development impact in the BRICS countries. Secondly, it aims to establish an extensive network of global partnerships with other national development banks and multilateral development institutions. Lastly, it strives to build a balanced project portfolio, keeping all factors in mind. BRICS efforts to challenge Western dominance in global economic institutions. There has been skepticism about the BRICS efforts to challenge Western dominance in global economic institutions. It has been said that the BRICS do not have enough in common or shared goals to function as an effective counterweight to the West. They have been touted to be deeply divided and are rather rivals than allies in the global economy and have achieved little. The BRICS have been attributed to be widely divergent economies, investing little in each other, having disparate foreign policy aims, and different forms of government. This skepticism is misleading, and in fact, the BRICS do have a common set of agendas as the motor to the coalition. The common experience of the BRICS nations and their rejection of the neoliberal development model that the IMF and the World Bank still employ is sign enough that the nations have a common consensus. Countries whose governments rejected this model developed faster, and the BRICS took cognizance of this fact and became more conscious since the financial and economic crisis. Thus, the BRICS countries' coherence becomes more apparent, and they have called for the reform of the IMF and the World Bank, only to meet with resistance. Rather than wait for these bodies to inculcate reforms, the BRICS took the matter into their own hands and established the new Development Bank in Shanghai. The BRICS' common agenda of pushing international economic governance away from neoliberalization was manifest when they complained of the West's austerity to hold back world growth. The central bank's unconventional monetary policy encouraged worldwide speculation rather than domestic growth. Given the recent attack from the West, BRICS has been in a constant state of transformation during its years of existence and development. Projected by the leading analysts of the world as the most powerful nations of the 21st century, the BRICS have a critical role in ushering in a new world order through the consolidation of international efforts, and such format lays down the foundation for a new global construction whose strength will determine how the world will stand. The BRICS cannot operate in isolation, demarcating the developing world from the developed Western alliance. The challenge for BRICS is the development of not a unipolar world, but a consolidated and constructive global scenario. The goal for BRICS is to also avoid the negative ramifications of globalization without distorting the world's economic continuum. It is important to continue following this path, to not hamper the growing potential of BRICS by the pole confrontation by the West. Some experts believe that the U.S. power is declining, and still the world is rotating on the liberal policies of the U.S. to achieve a balance of sorts. It can assimilate the rising powers of China, India, and Brazil. The struggle between the U.S. hegemony and the BRICS is not based on its fundamental principles, but a striving for world leadership. The other point of view proposes anarchy for Eurasian countries and how it is a great threat to the U.S. They believe that China and Russia are revisionist powers and show their claws because they are weak. The social situation in Central Asia may lead to an Arab Spring shortly, and thus Eurasia is in imminent danger. There is a collapse of regional order in the Middle East, and terrorism is on the rise. The Middle East order is collapsing. The long-standing Israel-Palestine conflict, unrest in Syria and Iraq, and the rise of ISIS led to the belief that there is a lack of a healthy tomorrow shortly. As a result of their domestic and international policies, the European countries are in trouble. Although a strong advocate of the Arab Spring, the European nations are reeling from the refugee crisis. The Muslim population is growing in Europe, making it vulnerable to terrorist attacks, as there is a lot of tussle between the predominantly Christian population and the Muslim people. It is further worsening the economic recovery for Europe, and it also challenges the European social system. The slowdown of the world economy has been like a contagious disease, spreading from the developed nations to the emerging economies, bringing numerous social upheavals. Diverging from the great powers' strategies has revealed that Europe is hardly the best partner for the US. Unlike Japan, and the European countries have no will or ability to follow the US lead. These points help us better understand what's happening in the world and how the BRICS have an important role to play in global politics. A certain geopolitical divergence in several issues is not surprising, with an account of different power and national interest pertaining to BRICS. The broadly shared commitment of the BRICS members towards the principle of non-interference has not translated into a unanimous position on international issues. Russia and China oppose external intervention in Syria, whereas Brazil and India have voted to condemn the Syrian government's violent crackdown on protests. The political significance of the BRICS has seen active participation in international organizations like the UN, WTO, IMF, and the World Bank. In informal associations like the Non-Aligned Movement, G77, G20, and APEC, it has also participated in regional organizations of Europe, Asia, Latin America, and Africa. There are great opportunities for co-participation, and the BRICS have recognized that to move towards a fairer world order. The BRICS should provide alternative leadership for developing nations so that they are no longer dependent on the U.S. The BRICS must create a platform for appropriate policies and response mechanisms for addressing local, regional, and international political and social turbulence. The BRICS can use their collective voice to preserve respect for international sovereignty in global affairs and represent a collective aspiration to influence global political governance. The urgent UN Security Council reforms must be on the BRICS agenda, and the BRICS grouping will generate a substantial interest, and some of the spheres for cooperation are as follows. The first is institutional flexibility, and while the BRICS nations have different visions about the group's role, it stands to reason that any agenda can be realized if it develops a coherent and sustained framework for continuous engagement. The mechanisms of policy formation must be dynamic and inclusive, and it is crucial to maintain flexibility too. The second is reviving traditional knowledge systems and practices. The BRICS must revive indigenous knowledge and practices in a range of domains. The BRICS nations are all members of G20 and significantly influence their regional affairs. But it is not enough to bring a consensus among the five member countries. The BRICS collectively represent 44% of the world's population, 26% world's area, and is home to 2.88 billion people. Together, they represent 32% of the world's GDP, and the World Bank expects the growth of BRICS to be up to 5.3%. The BRICS have been subjected to both praise and criticism, and the bilateral relations among them were based on non-interference, equality, and mutual benefit. The BRICS nations' development has not been similar due to the considerable difference in respective economic structures, leading to economic competition and even conflict. Along with the promotion of regional cooperation, the main idea of the formation of the BRICS was to challenge the U.S. status quo and form an alternative to the IMF and the World Bank. But the BRICS countries have their own potential challenges of political differences, economic instabilities, and territorial issues, among other things. And the best example is the case of the strife between India and China over encroachment. The member countries also have their differences regarding UNSC reforms, and it will be exceedingly difficult for them to reach a consensus over global affairs. Under the guardianship of the US, the world was witness to chaos and constant wars. In this situation, it is required to compete with US dominance over economic institutions, and the BRICS are trying to do just that. To provide a financial backup to the world, the BRICS came up with the concept of financial architecture and founded the financial institution of the New Development Bank. The NDB is facing a lot of challenges in integrating the members economically. While each of the five countries holds a 20% share in the same, the burden of the NDB cannot be shared practically in equal denominations among the countries due to the difference in the size of the economy. As each member has a great difference in GDP, disputes will inevitably arise in sharing the burden of the NDB among the BRICS countries. China strives to deepen cooperation in a market-driven digital economy, advance innovation, green technology, and accessible and sustainable infrastructure in almost every BRICS forum. The other countries are not doing so. Instead, they are focusing on strengthening regional cooperation, social responsibility, domestic issues, and issues pertaining to the people's well-being. South Africa is in its all-time low economy. India is reeling from terrorism, and Brazil needs to do poverty alleviation and healthcare reforms. In this situation, mutual understanding is of primary importance rather than discussing the profit-making economy and emerging markets. There are bigger challenges in store for the BRICS group. The rapid change in the global order has empowered Russia, China, and India to be major players in international affairs. The inability of the U.S. to stay constructively engaged in different global and regional issues has led this shift to happen, and also because of the BRICS members' growing significance in geoeconomics and politics over time. In order to counter U.S. hegemony, the BRICS need to engage in the grouping at the highest level, and it can only be possible when the members use the forum for consultation, coordination, and cooperation on contemporary socio-political issues in the world that are of mutual interest and also to promote mutual understanding. Mutual communication between Russia, China, and India is currently required. Bringing together new members and partners in the BRICS group is essential. Increasing the interaction of emerging economies seems like a plausible idea to safeguard interests, especially that of China and Russia. Although there is a lack of consensus among the BRICS, new partners and new members will open Pandora's box of possibilities and as well as challenges, and only time will tell if the BRICS can weather these challenges. As the BRICS usher in their second decade, they are busy consolidating their early achievements. In its first decade of existence, the BRICS were somewhat successful in pushing the IMF and World Bank quota redistribution, and they also offered an alternative option to the international financial order through the setting up of the NDB and the Contingency Reserve Agreement to provide infrastructure finance and liquidity to emerging and developing nations. The BRICS are also expected to advance a common agenda that focuses not only on continuity but also on an affirmative transformation for the member countries in areas of post-pandemic recovery, the transition to a green economy, and the fourth industrial revolution, although the broader setting in which the BRICS operate challenges the full realization of its potential. The war in Ukraine, the stagnation of the Russian and South African economies, and Brazil's economic and political crisis aggravated by the pandemic. The BRICS agenda covers both global governance issues and intra-BRICS cooperation, and among these there are four areas of great contemporary relevance. First, there is multilateralism with an emphasis on reformed multilateralism, including multilateral institutions reforms, deliberations on global governance, and ways to make it more effective and representative. Secondly, international security explores traditional and non-traditional threats to peace and security, and terrorism forms the lion's share of the debate. Other issues like the illegal flow of capital, money laundering, and violent extremism are also explored. Thirdly, digitalization emphasizes a global framework of digital public goods, digital governance, and digitalization for sustainable development. Digitalization is also used to encourage inclusivity in the growth and development process. Lastly, the area under discussion is climate change and SDGs on addressing the way climate change impacts the realization of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And specific issues are discussed, including the requirement of greater climate financing, capacity building, and favorable ecosystems for innovation. The first decade of BRICS saw the level of engagement deepening, ranging from high-level summits and ministerial meetings to various working groups and conferences. The members laid down the groundwork for cooperation, from improving economic ties to identifying areas of political convergence. Regarding trade, infrastructure finance, urbanization, and climate change, today there is a fair degree of cooperation between the BRICS countries. In improving the understanding of each other's industry, academia, and government, platforms such as the BRICS Academic Forum and Business Council have proven beneficial. The importance of the new development bank and the contingency reserve arrangement must be taken into consideration as they mark a paradigm shift from political rhetoric to delivering affirmative results, providing a clear and defined alternative to the Atlantic global governance system. As equal voting rights are given to the founding members of the NDB, reliance on local currencies is improved, and a new template for developing countries is there to emulate. In the current decade, two recent happenings have brought the divergence between the BRICS countries to the forefront. First is the India-China military standoff in the Doklam Plateau, highlighting that a cozy political relationship is always not quite possible between the BRICS nations. Secondly, China's Belt and Road Initiative is causing a stir in the BRICS group, as China is trying to include more nations in the group that are on the route of the same, thus trying to assume a superior and politically lucrative position in the BRICS. These events highlight the fact that pluralism and sovereign equality are going to be tested as soon as the national interests of each country come to the forefront. To stay relevant, the BRICS members must gauge the initiative's opportunities and inherent limitations. Firstly, the member countries must reaffirm their commitment to a multipolar world, and by doing so, they can address the asymmetry in power dynamics within the group and in global governance. With this approach, multilateralism will be safeguarded. Secondly, they must build on the success of the NDB and invest in other BRICS institutions so that it can be useful in developing an institutional research wing along the lines of the OECD, offering solutions better suited for the developing world. Thirdly, there should be a BRICS-led effort to meet their commitments under the Paris Agreement on climate change and the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. Setting up an energy alliance and energy policy institution can be favorable for the future of BRICS. Similarly, the NDB and other development finance institutions can be a potent vehicle to support and finance progress towards sustainable development goals. Fourthly, areas like outer space, the oceans, and the Internet can be expanded by extending the BRICS cooperation to address these things. Finally, direct interactions with their constituents must be encouraged among the BRICS nations, and it can foster relationships to cement the future of the BRICS. Four possible BRICS developmental scenarios are most likely to happen in the future. 1. There will be the maintenance of the status of a club of emerging nations that will exist to discuss a global agenda formulated by supranational alliances and other countries. 2. BRICS will increase its ability to influence the global agenda by expanding its membership and also building a political alliance. 3. It will step up economic growth and trade among the member countries by building an economic union and by way of intensifying their economic integration, and this economic union will be able to tackle the challenges faced by the BRICS countries. 4. It is to pursue political and cultural integration and economic integration if boosted